The town of Dustwater Creek wasn't much more than a dry trail stop, with a depot, a saloon, and a church that doubled as a schoolhouse when the preacher wasn't warning sinners about eternal fire. Folks lived simple, hard lives out here, and most men, once they'd scraped together enough cattle or land, sent letters east for a bride. Those women, plain-faced, steady-handed, God-fearing, were supposed to bring order into the lives of rough cowboys who'd grown tired of whiskey and loneliness. Marshall Colton Hayes was no different. He'd spent 15 years wearing the badge, trading bullets with rustlers and burying friends under the cruel sun. His ranch was lonely, his house as silent as the desert at night. So he'd sent for a bride. The agency promised someone humble, dutiful, a woman who'd patch his shirts and keep the dust off the windows. He didn't expect love. Love was a fancy thing for books and city folk. All he wanted was a steady partner who wouldn't flinch at prairie winds or the howl of coyotes. But that morning, when the train whistled into Dustwater Creek, Colton's expectation met something he hadn't braced for. The first step onto the platform belonged to a woman whose beauty didn't belong in a land of dust and gun smoke. Her hair was dark as midnight silk, her dress a shade of green that made the whole desert look washed out. Her eyes, sharp, searching, daring, met his as though she already knew him. The crowd fell silent. Cowboys leaned on fence posts, spitting, tobacco slower than usual. Women clutched their bonnets tighter. Even the saloon girls, painted and practiced in catching men's stares, looked away with envy. Colton's heart kicked against his ribs. He hadn't felt that kind of jolt since his youth, back when he thought he might live forever. He told himself, it was just surprise. She wasn't supposed to look like this. She wasn't supposed to stir something dangerous in him. A plain bride was safe. This woman was fire, and fire out here burned everything it touched. Her name was Elena Fairchild. She carried herself like she didn't belong to this land, but she also didn't shrink from it. When the wind whipped grit into her face, she didn't flinch. When a drunk stumbled from the saloon and whistled low, she gave him a look that sent him crawling back inside. Colton tipped his hat, throat dry as the desert. "Ma'am, I reckon you're here for me?" She smiled, not coy, not shy, but bold. "Marshall Hayes, I believe I am." It was that smile that cut him deepest. It wasn't the smile of a woman seeking safety. It was the smile of someone who knew her own worth, who carried secrets in her chest pocket the way he carried bullets in his belt. That night, as he hitched her trunk to his wagon, the whispers began. Folks muttered that no agency sent women like her west. Maybe she was running from something, a past, a man, a crime. Or maybe she was just too beautiful to belong to one man alone. Out here, beauty could start bar fights, stampedes, even shootouts. Colton knew it. He'd seen men kill for less. Yet when she sat beside him on that wagon, her perfume mixing with the sagebrush, he found himself afraid. Not of outlaws, not of Indians, not of the barren land, but of his own desire. Desire, in the West, was a weakness. It made men reckless, it made them stupid, and stupid men didn't live long. That first night at his ranch, as the coyotes howled and the wind rattled the shutters, Colton lay awake. The woman he'd sent for was supposed to be plain, someone who wouldn't stir his blood. Instead, Elena's presence had turned his safe house into a battlefield. He feared that his own longing, if unleashed, would burn through the fragile peace he'd carved out of the wilderness, and that was only the beginning. The frontier was a land where pasts caught up with people, where beauty could be both a blessing and a curse. Colton knew trouble rode behind her like a shadow, and he was right. But for now, under the endless desert sky, all he could think was, he had wanted a plain bride, and what he got instead was the kind of woman men went to war over. The West had a way of chewing on new stories like tobacco, spitting them out from one man's mouth to another until they were half lies and half truths. By the second day of Elena Fairchild's arrival, Dustwater Creek was already buzzing like a hornet's nest. At the saloon, men leaned across whiskey-stained tables, muttering that no bride agency east of the Mississippi sent women like her west. At the Mercantile, Matrons whispered behind gloved hands that her dresses were too fine, her manner too polished. Even the preacher raised his brows, wondering aloud if temptation had found a seat in his congregation. Colton Hayes heard every word. As marshal, it was his duty to listen, to keep his ear pressed to the ground for the tremble of trouble. But now those whispers weren't just town gossip. They cut too close to his own heart. He'd asked for a plain woman, someone to quiet the silence of his ranch, not set it ablaze. Instead, Elena stirred up more talk than a gold strike. Walking into town with her at his side was like dragging a lightning storm behind him. Men tipped their hats too slow, women stiffened their spines. He felt their eyes on him, asking silently, "Marshal, what have you done?" That night at the ranch, Colton sat on the porch rolling a smoke he didn't light. Elena had gone inside to unpack, humming some soft tune that didn't belong to the desert. The sound wrapped around him like the scent of rain before a storm. He should have felt comfort. Instead, he felt the edge of danger. "Marshal Hayes?" Her voice startled him. She stepped out, lantern light spilling over her face. That beauty, the kind that made the desert seem less cruel, gnawed at him like a hunger he couldn't feed without losing himself. "You hear what they're saying in town?" he asked, harsher than he meant. She tilted her chin, calm as a queen. "That I'm not what you expected?" Colton's jaw tightened. "They're saying more than that. They're wondering what you're running from." For a flicker of a moment, her eyes betrayed something, a shadow, quick as a rattler's strike. Then it was gone, replaced by a steady look. "Do you believe them?" He didn't answer right away. Out here, a man learned to trust his gut more than words. And his gut told him Elena wasn't just another runaway bride. She carried something heavy in her silence, something that might draw blood if it came chasing her. The coyotes howled, and Colton finally muttered, "I believe a woman's past belongs to her, until it puts bullets in other men's guns." She nodded once, as though she respected the line he'd drawn. Then she set the lantern on the porch rail and whispered, "I'll tell you when I'm ready." But readiness was a luxury the West rarely gave. By the week's end, rumors had turned sharper. A ranch hand swore he'd seen her face on a wanted poster back in Kansas City. A drifter claimed she was the runaway wife of a railroad baron. Every man had a different story, but all led to the same conclusion: trouble. One evening, Colton walked Elena into town for supplies. The saloon doors swung open and out staggered Virgil Tate, a mean-eyed cowboy with more scars than teeth. He leered at Elena, spitting tobacco close to her boots. "Well, ain't she a fine prize for the marshal?" Virgil drawled. "Reckon a woman like that don't come cheap. What's she really costin' you, Hayes?" The street went quiet. Elena's cheeks flushed, but her gaze never faltered. Colton's hand itched for his Colt, but drawing over words was a fool's game, and he wasn't about to give Virgil the satisfaction. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice low and cold. "She costs more than you can afford, Tate. Now move along before I write you up for disturbing the peace." Virgil smirked, but there was fear behind it. He slunk off, muttering curses. Still, the damage was done. The whole town had seen the exchange. Whispers would twist it into something worse by morning. That night, Colton found himself pacing. Every glance at Elena, her calm strength, the way she faced down men who'd crush another woman, tied him tighter to her. And yet the tighter the knot, the more he feared what would happen when it snapped. She was no plain bride. She was a storm in a land already half on fire. As he stared out over the moonlit prairie, Colton admitted something he hadn't dared before. The whispers weren't just about her past. They were about him, too. About a marshal who'd built his life on law and order, now trembling at the pull of a woman he couldn't control. And the worst part? He feared they were right. The Hayes Ranch sat a half-day's ride from Dustwater Creek, where the land rolled out in yellow grass and sage, where the horizon seemed endless, but the nights closed in tight. It was here Elena Fairchild was meant to settle, to become the plain bride Colton Hayes had ordered up like a man might order lumber or seed. But the house she stepped into was already divided, between silence and song, between shadows and longing. Elena proved herself quick enough. She could patch a fence, feed chickens, and cook beans without complaint. She carried her weight in a land that punished the lazy. But it wasn't her work that troubled Colton. It was the way she carried herself. Too graceful, too sure, too alive. Her beauty was more than skin deep. It radiated in her poise, her eyes, even her laughter, and that stirred up storms inside the marshal. He'd been a man of order his whole life. Every gunfight measured, every arrest clean. He knew how to face down outlaws and horse thieves. But this woman, his own bride, left him rattled. He'd catch himself watching the way her hair slipped loose while she hung laundry, or the way she stood on the porch in the twilight, eyes searching the horizon like she was waiting for someone or something to come. At supper, she filled the silence with stories of the East. She spoke of ballrooms, fine music, carriages in gaslit streets. Colton listened, chewing slow, pretending not to care. But in his gut he knew. She hadn't belonged to the world of dust and grit, not before. So why had she left it? One night thunder rolled low on the horizon. Colton stepped into the barn to calm the horses, but when he returned, he found Elena sitting by the window, lantern light on her face, eyes far away. She didn't hear him at first, and when she did, she startled, covering her expression too. Fast? You waiting for someone? He asked. Her lips curved, not quite a smile. Out here? Only the night. But the shadows in her eyes said otherwise. The house became a place of questions. Colton's desire for her grew heavier with each passing day, but so did his suspicion. What did she hide in her silence? Why did she jump when riders passed too close to the house? Why did her hand linger near the small leather satchel she never let out of sight? Colton had faced killers, rustlers, and drifters, yet the danger now wasn't outside his door. It was sitting across from him at the supper table, wearing a smile that unsettled his heart. The West had taught him that beauty was rarely innocent. A sunset could blind a man before the nights. Predators struck. A flowering cactus could hide thorns sharp enough to draw blood. Elena was no plain bride. She was both bloom and thorn. And as the storm clouds gathered outside, Colton realized the house wasn't divided by silence anymore. It was divided by truth, hers and his fear of it. It happened on a Saturday night when the town came alive. Dustwater Creek Saloon spilled over with cowboys eager for whiskey and dice. The piano clanged, boots stomped, and laughter carried out into the dusty street. Colton had brought Elena into town for supplies, but he should have known better. The moment she stepped through the swinging doors, the place went quiet as a graveyard. Every eye turned. The piano player missed a note. Cowboys who'd been shouting over cards leaned back in their chairs. Elena didn't flinch. She held herself, proud, chin lifted, as though she'd walked into finer rooms than this. That only made it worse. In a land starved of beauty, she was a spark tossed into dry brush. Virgil Tate, mean as a rattler and twice as unpredictable, saw her first. He slammed his drink down and swaggered over, grinning with broken teeth. Well, if it ain't Dustwater's newest angel. Tell me, sweetheart, what's a fine thing like you doing hitched to the law? Colton rose from his seat, his hand already near his gun. Back off, Tate. But Virgil wasn't the backing off kind. He leaned closer to Elena, his breath thick with rot-gut whiskey. Bet the marshal don't keep you warm at night. Bet you'd prefer a real man who ain't married to his badge. The saloon roared with nervous laughter, but no one dared step between them. Colton didn't think. He moved. His fist caught Virgil square in the jaw, sending him crashing into a card table. Whiskey spilled, cards scattered, chairs toppled. For a breath, silence. Then the place erupted. Virgil lunged back, fists swinging. Colton met him blow for blow, the two men crashing into chairs, shattering glass, sending men scrambling. The piano player stopped playing, shouting, "Clear the damn floor!" Elena stood rooted, her eyes wide but steady. She didn't scream, didn't faint. She watched as though she'd seen brawls before, maybe worse. That shook Colton almost as much as Virgil's fists. The fight raged until Colton pinned Virgil against the bar, his badge glinting under the oil lamps. "You so much as look at her again, I'll put you in the ground." Virgil spat blood and sneered. "She ain't yours to keep, Hayes. Women like her, they bring trouble. You'll see." The saloon muttered agreement. Men looked at Colton, with something between pity and warning. Elena's beauty was no blessing. It was tinder, and he'd just struck the match. Dragging Elena out into the night, Colton felt the eyes on his back. The town would remember this. He had enemies enough without adding Virgil Tate and every jealous cowboy in Dustwater Creek. But the worst part wasn't the fight. It was the fire he felt when Elena laid her hand on his arm, whispering, "You shouldn't have done that for me," because Colton knew she was right. Out here, a man couldn't afford to fight for desire. Yet when it came to her, he couldn't stop himself. That night, as the stars burned over the desert, Colton realized his fear wasn't of losing control. In a fight, it was of losing control of his heart. The West held its secrets in shadows, secrets of buried gold, of outlaw trails, of blood spilled and bones left to bleach in the desert sun. But no secret gnawed harder at Colton Hayes than the one he knew Elena Fairchild kept locked behind. Her eyes. It was late, the kind of night when the prairie stretched black and endless, and the coyotes howled like restless ghosts. The ranch house sat quiet, lamplight flickering through thin curtains. Colton had tried to sleep, but the memory of the saloon brawl still burned hot in his chest. Every time he shut his eyes, he saw Virgil Tate's bloodied grin and heard his warning. Women like her bring trouble. So he sat at the table, a bottle of rye half drained, the lantern hissing low. His badge lay on the wood before him, catching the dim glow. For years, that badge had been his anchor, his compass. Now, it felt heavy as a chain. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled his gaze up. Elena appeared wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. Even in the dim light, she looked like something the desert shouldn't have. Soft, untouchable, dangerous. "You're awake," she said softly. "So are you," he answered. His voice rough. She stepped closer, her eyes catching the lantern flame. "I couldn't sleep. Not after." She trailed off, but he knew she meant the fight. Colton leaned back, chair creaking. "You ought to know, Elena. Men don't brawl like that over a plain bride. You step into a room and half the West loses its senses." Her lips curved, not into a smile, but something sadder. "You think I don't know that?" The silence stretched. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Colton studied her, seeing the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched the shawl. She wasn't just beautiful, she was hunted by something. "Tell me," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "Tell me what you're running from." For a moment he thought she'd stay silent. But then she sank into the chair across from him, lantern light carving shadows under her eyes. "My name isn't just Elena Fairchild," she began. "Back east, I was Elena Blackwood." Colton's brow furrowed. The name tugged at him, like a half-remembered tune. "My father was Charles Blackwood, railroad magnate, a man with more enemies than friends." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "When he died, the fortune passed to me. But fortune makes wolves hungry. My fiancé," she spat the word like poison, "wasn't after me. He was after the inheritance. When I refused him, he swore no man would have me if he couldn't. He sent men after me. So I ran." Colton's jaw tightened. The pieces slid together, her fine manners, her polished bearing, the shadows in her eyes. She hadn't come west seeking a home. She'd come seeking refuge. "Why not tell me sooner?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Her gaze met his, steady but haunted. "Because every man who's ever known has tried to use me. For money, for power, for the name I carry. I thought if I came here, if I married plain, maybe I could finally be free." Her voice cracked. "But I'm not free, Colton. They'll follow. They always follow." The lantern hissed. The whiskey in Colton's gut turned to fire. He thought of Virgil's sneer, of the whispers in town, of the danger crawling closer on the horizon. He'd sworn to uphold the law, to keep Dustwater Creek safe, but protecting Elena meant dragging that danger straight to his doorstep. "Why tell me now?" he asked, softer this time. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. "Because you deserve to know what trouble I've brought into your life, and because—" She hesitated, then whispered, "Because I don't want to keep lying to you." The words hit him harder than any outlaw's bullet. He wanted to believe her. Hell, he did believe her. But belief didn't stop bullets. Colton stood, pacing, his boots heavy on the wood floor. "If what you say is true, they'll come. Men with money behind them, men who don't care how many they bury to get what they want." Elena's voice was steady now, though her eyes glistened. "I know. That's why I should leave. Tonight, before I bring more harm." Colton froze. Leave? The thought twisted inside him like barbed wire. He'd wanted a plain bride, someone safe, someone simple. Instead, he'd found a woman who turned his world upside down, and damn him, he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. "No," he said finally, his voice a growl. "You came here to start over. You're under my roof now, under my name. If trouble comes, it'll have to go through me first." For the first time, her mask cracked, her lips parted, her breath caught, and in her eyes, he saw both fear and something softer, something that mirrored the fire inside his own chest. The lantern sputtered, casting the room in flickering gold. Colton knew the storm was coming, faster than either of them could stop. But in that moment, as Elena's gaze held his, he felt a choice settle heavy on his shoulders. Uphold the badge, or guard the woman who had already stolen his heart, and, for the first time in his life, the law felt like the weaker oath. The desert carried news faster than telegraphs ever could. A whisper at a saloon in Kansas became a rumor in Colorado, then a certainty in Dustwater Creek. By the time the first rider galloped in with talk of bounty hunters heading west, Colton Hayes already felt the noose tightening. Elena's secret was no longer just between them. The town buzzed like a rattler's tail, men spitting tobacco and muttering that she'd brought danger to their doorstep, women huddling near the church, whispering that the marshal had taken up with a cursed bride. At first, Colton tried to shrug it off. Dustwater Creek had always thrived on gossip. But when he walked down Main Street with Elena on his arm, he felt the shift. Storekeepers gave curt nods instead of smiles. Old friends looked away. Even the preacher stopped mid-sermon to glare at her, as though she'd tempted sin into the very pews. That night, Colton sat at the edge of his porch, rifle across his knees. The prairie wind carried with it the smell of mesquite and dust. But beneath that, he swore he caught the faint scent of gun smoke. Imagined, maybe, but close enough to prickle the hair at the back of his neck. Elena stepped out beside him, her shawl wrapped tight. She didn't speak at first, just sat with him, eyes on the endless dark. Finally, she whispered, "They're coming, aren't they?" He nodded once. "Men who hunt for money don't quit easy. Word of a Blackwood inheritance will draw them like vultures." Her breath caught. "Then the town will turn on me. I've seen it in their eyes." Colton glanced at her, jaw tight. "The town'll do what it does. My job's to make sure none of them or anyone else puts a hand on you." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. He was one man, one badge, against bounty hunters with no law but greed. The first sign came 2 days later. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, black, hat low, rifle slung across his saddle. He didn't enter town, just circled, slow, like a wolf scenting prey. By dusk he was gone, leaving dust trails in his wake. The townsfolk noticed. Fear spread. Shop doors locked earlier. Saloon windows shuttered before midnight. Children were kept close. At the saloon, Virgil Tate raised his glass and spat venom loud enough for all to hear. "Marshal Hayes thinks he can keep a Blackwood princess safe? He's a fool. When them hunters come, it ain't his blood they'll be after, it's ours. Mark my words, we'll all pay for her." The words spread faster than wildfire. Soon, folks began to murmur about petitioning for Elena to leave. Some, even hinted they'd take matters into their own hands if Colton didn't act. Colton heard every word. Each one was a nail driven into the coffin of his standing in town. Yet when he returned home to Elena, he buried his fury deep. She already carried enough fear. That night he found her in the barn, stroking the mare's mane, her face pale in the lantern light. She turned to him, and he saw the tremble in her hands. "They'll hate me more with every rider that comes," she whispered. "I should go, Colton. If I leave, maybe they'll be safe." The thought struck him like a bullet. Letting her walk out would be easier. He'd save the town, save his badge. But the very idea hollowed him out. He'd fought rustlers, buried friends, stared down death a dozen times, but nothing terrified him more than losing her. He stepped closer, voice low but steady. "You think I care about their whispers? You think I've spent my life out here, bleeding for this land just to hand you over to wolves? No, Elena. You're mine to protect. As long as I draw breath, they'll have to ride through me to get to you." Her eyes filled, though she blinked the tears back. "And if they kill you?" Colton's mouth curved into the ghost of a smile. "Then I'll take a few with me. That's the bargain of the West." The silence hung heavy, broken only by the restless horses. Finally, Elena laid her hand on his chest, over the badge. "You're braver than the law allows, Marshal Hayes." And, in that touch, he felt the truth. He wasn't protecting her because of the badge. He was protecting her because she had become his, in ways he'd never thought possible. The next morning, riders appeared again. Not one this time, but 3, circling like hawks. Their rifles glinted in the sun, their laughter carried on the wind. They weren't in a hurry. Predators never were. Colton loaded his Winchester and watched them from the porch, Elena standing behind him. "Gunsmoke on the horizon," he muttered. The storm had arrived, and he knew, with every bone in his body, that Dustwater Creek was about to become a battlefield, not just for law and order, but for the heart he'd sworn he would never surrender. The weight of a badge was a strange thing. To most folks, it looked like tin, a simple star pinned to a man's chest. But to Colton Hayes, it had always been heavier than iron, heavier than lead. It meant duty. It meant law above all else. It meant drawing the line between order and chaos with his own blood if need be. But now that star felt like a brand searing his skin, because the woman in his home, the woman who had set fire to his heart, was pulling him across that line. The bounty hunters were closer every day. The town was restless. Fear had a way of poisoning men, and it didn't take much for whispers to turn into threats. Colton heard them in the saloon, in the mercantile, even outside the church after Sunday sermon. Folks weren't just worried, they were angry. Angry at Elena, angry at him for bringing her into their lives. One afternoon, Mayor Hollis himself rode out to the ranch, dust settling on his fine coat. He tipped his hat, but his eyes were hard. "Marshal," he said, "I've stood by you near on 15 years. Never doubted your judgment. But this here—" His gaze flicked to Elena, who stood silently on the porch. "This is more than Dustwater can carry. If them hunters ride in shooting, it won't just be you and her that bleed. It'll be women, children, good folk." Colton's jaw clenched. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying the town expects you to do your duty, uphold the law. If that means handing her over, so be it." The words hit like a whip. Hand her over. Wash his hands clean. Keep the town safe. It was the logical choice, the lawful choice. But when he looked at Elena, her eyes shadowed, her hands gripping the porch rail as though bracing for the world to collapse, he knew the law was asking too much of him. "She's under my protection," Colton said, voice like stone, "and that's where she'll stay." The mayor sighed, mounting his horse. "Then you'd best be ready, Marshal, 'cause when the shooting starts, the town won't thank you. They'll curse your name." Colton watched him ride off, the sun sinking red behind him. For the first time in years, doubt gnawed at him like rust eating through steel. Could he protect her and the town both? Or was he choosing one over the other? That night, Elena found him in the barn, sharpening his knife by lantern light. She stepped close, her voice soft but steady. I heard what the mayor said. He's right. I don't want innocent people hurt because of me. If giving me up is the law, then do it. Colton set the knife down hard enough to shake the table. His eyes burned as he looked at her. Don't you ever say that again? She flinched, but not from fear, more from the weight of his words. You think I wear this badge for men like Hollis? Colton went on, his voice rough. I wear it because someone has to stand between good folk and the wolves. But you... He paused, his chest rising like he'd wrestled with the words too long. You ain't a wolf, Elena. You're the reason a man remembers why he fights at all. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the barn was silent except for the horses shifting in their stalls. Then she whispered, And if standing for me makes you the enemy of the town? Colton leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. Then so be it. I'd rather be cursed for keeping you safe than praised for handing you over. The truth of it seared through him. He was no longer the law's man, not entirely. He was hers, but that choice came at a cost. He knew the bounty hunters weren't the only danger now. The townsfolk themselves might rise against him, driven by fear. He was a marshal split in two, sworn to the town, bound to Elena. Law and love pulling him in opposite directions. That night, he lay awake beside the window, rifle across his lap. Elena slept in the next room, her breathing steady, soft, but his mind churned. He thought of the men who would come riding under the cover of night, rifles ready, spurred by greed. He thought of the townsfolk who might decide the only way to save Dustwater Creek was to betray its marshal. And he thought of Elena, her beauty, her fire, her courage, and how she had turned his world into something both terrifying and worth dying for. For the first time in his life, Colton Hayes realized the law couldn't save him. The law was lines on paper, words in men's mouths. Out here, on the edge of the frontier, what mattered was the choices a man made when the dust rose and gunsmoke filled the air. And his choice was clear. He would stand for her, against the hunters, against the town, against fate itself if need be. But as the horizon darkened, one truth burned brighter than all the rest. Choosing her meant he might lose everything else. The dilemma was no longer whether to protect her. It was whether his heart could bear the cost of what was coming. The desert has a way of holding its breath before blood is spilled. The night before the duel, Dustwater Creek was so still you could hear the creak of weathered boards, the flap of a loose shutter, the lonely call of a coyote drifting across the plains. Everyone in town knew what morning would bring. Colton Hayes knew it too. The bounty hunters had ridden in at dusk, their silhouettes sharp against the dying sun. But they weren't the ragtag drifters Colton had expected. These men rode clean, horses, carried rifles polished with care, and bore the confidence of wolves who'd cornered their prey. Leading them was a man Elena recognized the instant his boots hit the dirt, her former fiancé, Raymond Harlan. He wasn't the drunk, whispering fool Colton had imagined from her stories. Harlan was tall, sharp-eyed, his suit dusty but cut from expensive cloth, a pistol gleaming at his hip. His smile was thin, practiced, the kind of smile that promised ruin. Elena, he drawled, tipping his hat as though greeting a lady at a ballroom. You ran long enough. Time to come home. Elena's face went pale, but she stood her ground beside Colton. I'd rather die here than go back to you. Harlan's smile faltered. His eyes flicked to Colton, cold as steel. Marshal Hayes, brave of you to shelter what isn't yours, but you know how this ends. The girl comes with me, or I take her over your grave. Colton's hand hovered near his Colt. You'll have to draw before you take her. The air thickened. Dustwater Creek gathered in silence, townsfolk peering from behind shutters and half-open doors. Everyone knew what was coming. A duel at dawn, law against greed, heart against hate. That night Colton prepared. He sat at his table, cleaning his gun with hands steady as stone. Elena hovered in the doorway, her face caught between fear and something deeper. You don't have to do this, she whispered. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Yes, I do. A man can run from many things, but not from himself, and not from love. Her breath caught. She crossed the room, taking his hand. the calloused fingers of a marshal tangled with the soft, trembling hand of the woman who'd changed everything. "If you die out there, Colton," he cut her off with a rough whisper, "then I'll die knowing I chose right." The night crawled by, heavy with silence. Before dawn, the church bell tolled once, its echo stretching across the town like a final warning. Colton stepped into the street, boots crunching against dust still cool from the night. The sky was streaked pink and gold, the kind of sunrise that belonged to a land too wild to be tamed. Folks lined the edges of the street, their faces tight with fear and awe. Elena stood near the saloon porch, her hands clenched around her shawl, eyes never leaving him. Harlan waited at the far end, his men watching like vultures. He tipped his hat, smirking. "Hope you said your prayers, Marshal." Colton's voice was calm, steady. "Hope you wrote your will." They faced each other 20 paces apart. The street held its breath, even the wind seemed to stop. The saloon doors creaked. A dog barked once, then went quiet. "Draw!" someone shouted. Harlan's hand blurred toward his gun, faster than most men could see. But Colton had lived his life on the edge of gun barrels, and his draw was as natural as breathing. His Colt cleared leather, the hammer cocked, and he fired. The report cracked through the morning like thunder. Harlan staggered, eyes wide, a red bloom spreading across his chest. His pistol slipped from his hand, clattering into the dust. He fell to his knees, mouth working for words that never came, then toppled face first into the dirt. Silence. Then slowly, the sound of whispers, gasps, the release of a town that had been holding its lungs tight. Colton lowered his gun, smoke curling from the barrel. He looked across the street, not at the dead man, not at the hunters who shifted uneasily now that their leader was gone, but at Elena. Her eyes were wet, her lips parted, and in her gaze he saw both relief and fear. Relief that he lived. Fear of what his choice meant. That he had killed not just for law, but for her. The bounty hunters exchanged looks. One spat into the dust. "He was paying us. He's gone now. Ain't no reason to stick round." They mounted and rode out, leaving the body where it lay. Colton holstered his Colt, his chest rising heavy. The duel was done. The law had held. But he knew this wasn't the end. A man like Harlan left shadows long after his body hit the ground. Elena rushed to him, her hands clutching his arm, her face pale. "You could have died," she whispered, voice trembling. Colton looked down at her, brushing dust from his coat. "So could he. Difference is, I had a reason worth dying for." The words hung between them, truer than any oath he'd ever sworn. The dawn had broken, but the day ahead promised more fire. For now, though, the duel was won, and Dustwater Creek would remember the morning their marshal faced death not just for duty, but for desire. Dustwater Creek slept uneasy after the duel. The sun rose, the body of Raymond Harlan was hauled away, and folks whispered of the marshal who had stood against death and won. Some called Colton Hayes a hero. Others said he'd cursed the town by tying himself to Elena, a woman whose beauty drew bullets like honey drew flies. But while the whispers faded, vengeance did not. Harlan might have fallen in the street, but his men weren't all gone. Some rode out of town that morning, sure, but others lingered hidden in the gullies and canyons beyond. Wolves without their alpha still had teeth, and in the black of night, they bared them. Colton was awake when it began. He sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, stars scattered like silver dust overhead. He'd learned long ago that peace in the West never lasted. The night smelled strange, sharp, oily. Then he saw the flicker on the horizon, orange where there should have been nothing but dark. "Fire," he muttered. By the time he rushed to the barn, the dry hay was already ablaze, flames clawing skyward, sparks leaping from beam to beam. Horses screamed inside, eyes rolling white. Colton threw the doors wide, smoke choking him as he stumbled in. He slashed the ropes loose, smacking the flanks of the panicked animals until they bolted into the night. "Elena!" he roared. She appeared from the house, skirts pulled high, eyes wide in terror as the inferno lit her face. Behind her, gunfire, cracked, shadows moving at the edge of the ranch, Harlan's men returning to finish what their boss had failed to do. Colton raised his rifle, firing into the dark. A shape dropped, cursing. Another shot whistled past his ear. Elena ducked behind the well, her hands trembling but her voice sharp. "They're trying to burn us alive." The flames spread fast, jumping from barn to corral, licking toward the hard house. Heat pressed against them like the breath of hell itself. Colton fired again, then grabbed Elena's arm. "Inside, we can't let 'em torch the house." They ran through the door, smoke already seeping through the shutters. Colton shoved a heavy table against the windows, bracing for the men outside. "Take this," he said, thrusting a pistol into Elena's hands. She stared at it, then at him. "I've never—" "Point, squeeze, and don't you hesitate. You hear me?" Her eyes hardened. She nodded. The next hour blurred into chaos. Shots cracked. Through windows, bullets splintering wood. Colton fired back, every squeeze of the trigger pushing another man into the dust. Elena, crouched by the doorframe, raised the pistol with shaking hands and fired. The sound jolted her, but when a shadow dropped outside, her fear burned into something fiercer. "Good girl," Colton muttered, reloading. The fire roared, closer now, sparks raining across the roof. Smoke thickened, clawing at their throats. Colton's eyes burned. They couldn't hold out much longer. Then, through the crackle of flames and gunfire, came a voice. "Marshal Hayes, you brought this on yourself." One of Harlan's men bellowed. "Come out and maybe we let the girl live." Colton's jaw clenched. He knew the truth. Step outside and Elena was lost. Stay inside and they'd both burn. He looked at her, soot streaking her face, eyes bright with defiance. "No," she whispered, reading his thoughts. "We fight. Together." Something surged in him at those words. Not just desire, but respect. Love forged in fire and bullets. He gripped her hand tight. "Together, then." With a roar, he kicked the door wide, rifle blazing. Elena fired beside him, her shot ringing true. Men cursed and fell. Flames lit the battlefield, painting everything in blood and gold. It felt like forever, but at last the gunfire ebbed. The ranch yard lay scattered with bodies, the survivors limping into the night. Silence returned, broken only by the roar of fire devouring what was left of the barn. Colton staggered, chest heaving, rifle smoking in his hands. Elena dropped the pistol, tears streaking through the soot on her cheeks. "It's over," she whispered. "Not yet," Colton said, staring at the burning ruin. "But we're alive. That's a start." They stood side by side, watching the barn collapse into glowing ash. The night smelled of smoke and blood, of loss and survival. Elena slipped her hand into his, her grip firm. "You didn't just fight for me tonight. You fought with me. I'll never forget that." Colton squeezed her hand, eyes on the flames. "A marshal ain't supposed to fear nothing, but I feared losing you more than any bullet or fire." The fire had taken his barn, his livelihood, maybe even the town's last shred of trust in him. But in the ashes something stronger rose, a bond forged not by words but by battle. Dustwater Creek would wake to charred ruins, whispers of gunfire, and a marshal who had chosen his heart over the law. The future was uncertain. Enemies would come again. But for now, in the glow of fire and ashes, Colton and Elena stood unbroken. Morning broke over Dustwater Creek with the smell of smoke still hanging heavy in the air. Ash drifted across the Hayes Ranch soft as snow, settling over blackened timbers where the barn once stood. The ground bore scars of the night's battle, bullet holes in the porch posts, blood soaking the dirt, spent shells glinting in the pale light. The townsfolk came slowly, drawn by the ruin, by curiosity, by fear. Some carried buckets of water, others only suspicion. They found Marshal Colton Hayes standing tall despite the soot and blood on his clothes, Elena Fairchild at his side, her shawl draped over smoke-stained shoulders. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "She brought this trouble here. Barn's gone because of her. But he saved us from Harlan. A marshal don't fight for a woman, he fights for the law." Colton heard every word, but his eyes never left the horizon. He'd faced outlaws, gunmen, bounty hunters. But the hardest enemy to fight was doubt. and doubt was what lingered in Dustwater now. Mayor Hollis pushed through the crowd, his face grim. "Marshal," he said, "the town's grateful you held off them men. But look around you. This land's burned. Folks are scared. You keep her here, you're asking for more trouble." Elena stiffened, her hands tightening in her shawl. She opened her mouth to speak, but Colton laid a hand on hers. His voice was steady, the voice of a man who had carried law on his shoulders too long to tremble now. "I swore to protect this town," he said. "And I did. But I also swore something else, though maybe not with words. I swore to protect her. She stays." A murmur swept the crowd, anger and awe tangled together. Hollis shook his head, exasperated. "You're choosing her over your duty, Colton." "No," Colton said, his eyes fierce. "I'm choosing her as my duty." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then the mayor sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine, but the cost is on your shoulders. Don't expect the town to thank you." The crowd dispersed slowly, leaving behind only scorched earth and the two figures standing in the wreckage. Elena turned to Colton, tears brimming. "You could have sent me away, you could have saved yourself all this." He looked at her then, really looked, at the woman who had stepped off the train weeks ago, who had upended his ordered life, who had set his heart to racing and his soul to trembling. "Elena, when you first came, I expected a plain bride. Someone I could live beside without thinking twice, but you—" His voice caught, raw with truth. "You're the beauty who made me fear my own desire. And now I know why. Because wanting you meant risking everything, and I'd risk it all again." Her breath shuddered, tears spilling down her cheeks. She reached for him, her hand soft against his soot-stained face. "Then let me stay. Not as a burden, not as a shadow of my past. Let me stay as yours." The words lit something in him no fire could consume. He drew her close, the world falling, away until it was only the two of them in the ruins of his ranch, bound not by circumstance but by choice. Days turned into weeks. Together they rebuilt, first the barn, then the fences, then the fragile trust of the town. Some folk still looked at Elena with suspicion, but others began to see what Colton saw, a woman who worked harder than any man, who laughed despite scars, who stood shoulder to shoulder with their marshal when the West tried to break them. And as for Colton, the fear he once felt, the fear of desire, of losing control, shifted into something else entirely. He learned that love didn't weaken a man. It gave him reason to fight harder, to stand taller, to keep living when bullets flew and barns burned. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, Colton stood with Elena on the porch of their rebuilt home. The air smelled of fresh cut timber, not smoke. The land stretched wide and untamed before them, the West itself a promise and a threat. Elena leaned against him, her voice quiet. "Do you ever regret it? Choosing me over the law?" Colton wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "The law's just words, Elena. You're flesh and blood. You're the reason the words ever mattered." She smiled then, soft and full, and for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt she belonged. Not because the town had accepted her, not because her past had disappeared, but because one man, the only one who mattered, had chosen her without hesitation. In the Wild West, beauty was often fleeting, burned away by dust and gunfire. But Elena Fairchild stayed, and in the heart of Marshal Colton Hayes she had planted roots stronger than any badge, stronger than any fear. The plain bride he had expected never came. Instead, he'd found the beauty who had changed everything, and when the dust settled, she was the beauty who stayed.